Imagine being trapped in a one-room cabin with temperatures dropping to 40 below zero. No heat except a failing fire. No food except what you stored months ago. And the nearest town is 50 miles away through snowdrifts taller than a horse. Winter in the Wild West wasn't just cold, it was a death sentence for the unprepared. While Hollywood shows us gunfights and bank robberies, the real killer in the Old West wasn't outlaws or Indians. It was winter. More settlers, cowboys, and prospectors died from freezing starvation and winter-related diseases than from all the shootouts combined. Between November and March, entire communities could be cut off from the outside world for months. One bad blizzard could bury a town under 10 feet of snow overnight. And if you didn't prepare properly before the first freeze, you probably wouldn't see spring. That's why survival in the Wild West wasn't about being the fastest draw. It was about being the best planner. The difference between life and death came down to what you did in September and October. Now, we're not talking about city folks back east with their coal deliveries and general stores. We're talking about frontier families, isolated ranchers, and mining camps miles from civilization. Before we talk about how they survived, we need to understand just how brutal winter could be in the Wild West. Because this wasn't your typical cold snap. This was nature at its most merciless. The Great Plains and Rocky Mountains experienced what pioneers called blue northers. These were Arctic cold fronts that could drop temperatures 50 degrees in less than an hour. You could be working outside in shirt sleeves at noon, and by 2 p.m. you'd be fighting for your life in a whiteout blizzard. Cowboys caught out on the range during a blue norther would sometimes freeze to death in their saddles. Their horses would keep walking, carrying frozen corpses until someone found them days later. It happened more often than you'd think. The winter of 1886 to 1887 became known as the Great Die-Up. Temperatures across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas plunged to 55 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Snow piled up so deep that cattle couldn't reach grass. They starved by the thousands frozen solid where they stood. Some ranchers lost 90% of their herds. Entire fortunes disappeared overnight. Cowboys found cattle packed so tight in ravines trying to escape the wind that they'd suffocated standing up. When spring came, the smell of rotting carcasses could be detected for miles. But cattle weren't the only victims. Homesteaders who hadn't prepared properly faced the same fate. Families would be found frozen in their cabins, huddled together for warmth that never came. Some burned their furniture, then their floorboards, then the walls of their own homes trying to stay warm. They'd survive the cold only to die when the roof collapsed under the weight of snow. In some cases, entire families were buried alive when avalanches of snow slid off nearby hills and buried their cabins completely. Rescuers wouldn't find them until spring thaw revealed the tragedy. The Donner Party is perhaps the most famous example of winter's deadly power in the West. In 1846, a group of 87 pioneers got trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains by early snow. They were stuck at what's now called Donner Pass from November until February. Only 48 survived. The rest died from starvation, exposure, and disease. The survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. It's a horrific story, but it illustrates just how quickly winter could turn deadly if you were caught unprepared. Mining camps in the mountains faced unique dangers. These camps were often established in remote locations accessible only by narrow mountain trails. When winter hit, those trails became impassable. Miners would be trapped for months with whatever supplies they had on hand. Some camps ran out of food by January and faced a choice. Try to walk out through deep snow and risk freezing to death, or stay and slowly starve. Many chose to walk out. Most of them died trying. Their bodies would be found in spring, frozen in the snow just miles from safety. So how did anyone survive? The answer starts with something every frontier family obsessed over from the moment summer ended: firewood. This wasn't just about staying comfortable. This was about staying alive. A family of 4 needed 20 to 30 cords of wood to make it through a harsh winter. If you don't know what a cord is, picture a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Now multiply that by 30. That's how much wood you needed. Cutting that much wood was a full-time job that started in late summer. Men would spend weeks in the forest felling trees, cutting them into manageable lengths, splitting them and hauling them back to the homestead. Every piece had to be stacked properly to dry. Wet wood won't burn hot enough to keep you warm when it's 30 below outside. Smart settlers would stack their wood against the north wall of their cabin. It provided extra insulation and kept the wood close when blizzards made it dangerous to go outside. The type of wood mattered too. Hardwoods like oak, hickory, and maple burned hotter and longer than softwoods like pine or fir. But hardwoods were harder to split and took longer to dry. Most families used a mix: softwood for kindling and quick heat, hardwood for the long overnight burns that kept you from freezing in your sleep. Some families would load their stove before bed and damper it down so it would burn slowly all night. You'd wake up to a cold cabin, but at least there'd be coals to restart the fire. Some families would build a wood tunnel, a covered walkway from the cabin door to the woodpile. When snow buried everything and you couldn't see 3 feet in front of your face, that tunnel was a lifeline. People died walking 20 feet from their cabin to their barn because they got disoriented in a whiteout. A rope stretched between buildings could save your life. Many families kept one hand on that rope whenever they went outside during a storm. There are accounts of men who let go of the rope for just a moment and were never seen again, frozen to death within shouting distance of their own front door. But firewood alone wouldn't keep you alive. You needed food, and lots of it. The growing season in most of the West was short, maybe 90 to 120 days. Everything you'd eat from November to April had to be grown, hunted, or purchased before the first snow. Root cellars were essential. These were underground rooms usually dug into a hillside or beneath the cabin floor where temperatures stayed just above freezing even in the depths of winter. A properly built root cellar could keep potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets fresh for months. Families would harvest hundreds of pounds of root vegetables in the fall. Potatoes were the most important. They were filling, nutritious, and could last all winter if kept cool and dark. A family might store 500 to 1,000 pounds of potatoes. That sounds like a lot until you realize you're feeding 4 or 5 people for 6 months with no other fresh food available. Potatoes were eaten, boiled, fried, baked, and mashed. By March, most families were sick of potatoes, but they were grateful to have them. Cabbage was another winter staple. It could be stored fresh in the root cellar or made into sauerkraut. Sauerkraut wasn't just food, it was medicine. The fermentation process created vitamin C, which prevented scurvy. Many frontier families survived winter on sauerkraut, potatoes, and salt pork. It wasn't exciting, but it kept you alive. The process of making sauerkraut was simple, but required attention. Shred the cabbage packet in a crock with salt, weight it down, and let it ferment for several weeks. The smell was terrible, but the result could save your life. Apples, if you were lucky enough to have an orchard, could be stored in the root cellar or dried. Dried apples would last indefinitely and could be reconstituted in water for pies or sauce. Some families would make apple butter, cooking down apples with sugar and spices until it was thick enough to spread. A crock of apple butter was a luxury that made hard biscuits and cornbread almost enjoyable. Onions and garlic hung in braids from the cabin rafters. Squash and pumpkins lined the root cellar shelves. Every inch of storage space was precious. But vegetables alone wouldn't sustain you through a hard winter. You needed protein, and that meant meat. Lots of it. The fall slaughter was one of the most important events of the year. Families would butcher hogs, cattle, or sheep in late October or early November. Timing was critical. You wanted cold weather to help preserve the meat, but you couldn't wait too long, or an early blizzard might trap your livestock where you couldn't reach them. Some families would watch the weather signs obsessively. When the geese flew south early, or the woolly bear caterpillars had extra thick coats, old-timers knew a hard winter was coming. A single hog could provide 200 pounds of meat and fat. That fat was just as valuable as the meat. It would be rendered into lard for cooking, baking, and even making soap and candles. Nothing was wasted. The intestines became sausage casings. Frontier families would invite neighbors over for fresh liver and heart the day of slaughter. It was one of the few times you'd eat fresh meat all winter, and one of the few social gatherings before everyone hunkered down for the long, cold months ahead. Most of the pork was cured with salt or smoked. We're talking about the same process cowboys used on the trail, but on a much larger scale. Hams and bacon would be packed in salt for weeks, then hung in the smokehouse. A properly cured ham could last 6 months or more. The smokehouse was a small building usually separate from the cabin to reduce fire risk, where meat hung from rafters while a slow fire of hickory or apple wood burned below. The smoke preserved the meat and gave it flavor. Some families would smoke meat for days or even weeks. Beef was harder to preserve because the cuts were larger, but it could be done. Strips of beef would be salted and dried into jerky or canned if the family had glass jars and knew how to use them. Canning was relatively new technology in the late 1800s. Mason jars with rubber seals became available in the 1880s, and they revolutionized food preservation. Families could now preserve vegetables, fruits, and even meat in glass jars that would last for years. A well-stocked pantry might have 200 to 300 jars of canned goods. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, berries, pickles, jams, and jellies lined the shelves. Each jar represented hours of work during the summer harvest, but in January, when the snow was 6 feet deep, those jars were worth more than gold. Wild game supplemented stored food. Deer, elk, and antelope were hunted in the fall, and the meat was preserved. Some families would shoot a deer and hang the entire carcass in an unheated shed. It would freeze solid and stay frozen all winter. You'd saw off chunks as needed, like cutting from a block of ice. Buffalo, before they were nearly wiped out, provided enormous amounts of meat. A single buffalo could feed a family for months. The meat was dried into jerky or pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that could last for years. Native Americans had perfected pemmican over centuries, and smart settlers learned the technique from them. But here's something that might surprise you. Many frontier families kept chickens through the winter. Chickens are surprisingly cold-hardy if you protect them from wind and keep them dry. A small flock of hens would provide fresh eggs all winter long, even when temperatures dropped below zero. Those eggs were precious. They provided protein, fat, and vitamins that were hard to get from stored food. Some families would preserve eggs by coating them in lard or water glass, a sodium silicate solution that sealed the shell and kept the egg fresh for months. Preserved eggs didn't taste quite as good as fresh, but they were edible and nutritious. Dairy was another challenge. If you had a cow, you had fresh milk, but only if you could keep that cow alive through winter. That meant storing tons of hay and keeping the barn warm enough that water wouldn't freeze. A dairy cow needs to drink 30 to 50 gallons of water a day. In winter, that meant breaking ice multiple times a day, or keeping a fire going in the barn to prevent freezing. Some families would bring their cow into the cabin during the worst cold snaps. Yes, you read that right. The cow slept in the cabin. It sounds crazy, but a 1,200-pound cow generates a lot of body heat. That heat could mean the difference between freezing and surviving. Milk could be made into cheese or butter, both of which would keep for months in cold storage. Some families would make huge wheels of cheese in the fall, 50 or 60 pounds each, and store them in the root cellar. That cheese would feed the family all winter and might even be traded for other supplies. Butter was packed into crocks and covered with a layer of salt. It would keep for months and was used sparingly because it was so valuable. A tablespoon of butter could transform a bowl of boiled potatoes into something almost enjoyable. Flour, cornmeal, and dried beans were purchased in bulk before winter. A family might buy 500 pounds of flour, enough to make bread, biscuits, and pancakes all winter. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat flour and just as filling. Johnny cakes, a simple cornmeal flatbread, were a staple breakfast. Dried beans, just like on the cattle drives, were eaten multiple times a week. They were cheap, filling, and lasted forever if kept dry. Sugar, salt, coffee, and tea were luxuries that had to be purchased before winter. Running out of coffee was considered a minor tragedy. Many frontier families were addicted to coffee and drank it morning, noon, and night. When coffee ran out, they'd make substitutes from roasted chicory root, roasted barley, or even roasted acorns. It didn't taste like coffee, but it was hot and gave you something to drink besides water. Salt was essential for preserving meat and flavoring food. A family might use 50 to 100 pounds of salt in a winter. But even with all this preparation, winter could still kill you, because the cold wasn't the only danger. Isolation was just as deadly. When snow blocked the roads and trails, you were completely cut off from the outside world. If someone got sick or injured, there was no doctor. If you ran out of food, there was no store. If your cabin caught fire, there was no help coming. You were on your own, and that reality terrified even the toughest pioneers. Medical emergencies were a death sentence. A simple infection could kill you. A broken bone that didn't set properly could cripple you for life. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Women who went into labor during winter often died because there was no midwife or doctor available. Families would do their best with home remedies and prayer, but sometimes that wasn't enough. Every frontier cemetery has tiny graves from babies born in winter who didn't survive. Mothers died in childbirth at alarming rates. Some estimates suggest 1 in 8 women died giving birth on the frontier. Disease spread quickly in close quarters. When one family member got sick, everyone usually caught it. Pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis killed thousands. Families would be found in spring, all dead in their beds, victims of illness they couldn't fight off. Some towns lost a quarter of their population during bad winters. The survivors would have to bury the dead when the ground thawed, sometimes months after they died. Bodies were stored in sheds or barns, frozen solid, waiting for spring when the ground was soft enough to dig graves. Cabin fever was real and dangerous. Being trapped inside a small space with the same people for months on end drove some folks insane. There are accounts of men walking out into blizzards and never coming back, choosing to die rather than spend another day in that cabin. Domestic violence increased during winter. Alcohol abuse was rampant. Anything to escape the monotony and claustrophobia of winter isolation. Some men would drink themselves to death on homemade whiskey, leaving their families to fend for themselves. Children suffered especially. Imagine being 8 years old, trapped inside a one-room cabin for 4 months with nothing to do. No school, no friends, no toys, except maybe a corn husk doll or a wooden horse your father carved. Some families were better at coping than others. They'd tell stories, sing songs, play games, and read the Bible over and over. Education continued if the parents were literate. Children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic by candlelight. Some frontier children became remarkably well educated because winter gave them nothing to do but read. But supplies were always limited. Candles and lamp oil had to last all winter. Many families went to bed when the sun set to conserve fuel. They'd sleep 12 or 14 hours a day during the darkest months. It was boring, but it saved resources and kept you warm under piles of quilts and furs. Some families would all sleep in the same bed, sharing body heat. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford in winter. Speaking of staying warm, clothing was crucial. Frontier families wore layers upon layers. Wool was the fabric of choice because it insulates even when wet. A typical winter outfit might include wool long underwear, wool pants, wool shirt, wool vest, wool coat, and a fur hat. Boots were lined with fur or felt. Mittens were better than gloves because your fingers could share warmth. Some people wore 2 or 3 pairs of socks. Women wore multiple petticoats under their dresses and wool shawls wrapped around their shoulders. Frostbite was a constant threat. Lose a finger or toe to frostbite and you'd be disabled for life. Gangrene could set in and kill you. Frontier doctors amputated frozen limbs with saws and no anesthesia. You'd bite down on a leather strap and pray you didn't die from shock or infection. Some people lost their noses or ears to frostbite. You'd see old-timers with missing fingers or toes, permanent reminders of a winter that almost killed them. The psychological toll of winter was immense. Seasonal depression affected nearly everyone. The endless gray skies, the bitter cold, the isolation, it wore people down. Some gave up. They'd stop eating, stop caring, and slowly fade away. Others became obsessed with survival, counting every potato, rationing every candle, living in constant fear that supplies would run out. Marriages fell apart under the strain. Families that seemed strong in summer would be at each other's throats by February. The spring thaw brought relief, but also new dangers. Melting snow caused floods that could wash away cabins and drown livestock. Rivers became raging torrents impossible to cross. Ice jams would form, creating temporary dams that would suddenly break and send walls of water downstream. Entire towns were washed away by spring floods, and when families finally emerged from their cabins after months inside, they'd discover who among their neighbors hadn't made it. Every spring brought the grim task of checking on isolated homesteads and finding frozen bodies. Some families would pack up and leave after one hard winter, heading back east or to California where winters were milder. They'd sell their land for pennies or just abandon it. The West was littered with empty cabins, silent monuments to people who couldn't survive another winter. Homestead claims were often abandoned after a single brutal winter. The government offered free land, but keeping that land required surviving conditions that broke even strong people. But those who stayed, who learned to prepare properly and endure the hardship, they built the West. They proved that humans could survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Their descendants still live in those same areas today, though modern heating and grocery stores have made winter much less deadly. The skills they developed, the preservation techniques, the sheer determination, these became part of Western culture. Towns that survived multiple hard winters developed strong communities. Neighbors helped each other because they knew survival depended on cooperation. If one family's cabin burned down, the whole town would help. Rebuild it before winter returned. If someone ran low on food, neighbors would share what they had. This wasn't charity, it was survival. You helped others because someday you might need help yourself. The next time you see a Western movie with cowboys riding through sunny landscapes, remember the real story. Remember the families huddled around failing fires, rationing their last potatoes, praying for spring. Remember that winter, not gunfights, was the real test of survival in the Wild West. Those who survived weren't the fastest or the strongest. They were the most prepared, the most resourceful, and the most determined. That's the true spirit of the Wild West, and it was forged in the brutal cold of winter.